Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 ISPP Annual Conference. I'm pleased to be here today with you. My name is Allison Harrell, and I'm one of the conference co-chairs, and I will be moderating the discussion later with the ISPP President, Felicia Pratto. So I'm going to hand it over to her right now to give her presidential address entitled Why Political Psychology and ISPP Benefit from Including Work and Members from Varieties of Political Systems, Positions, Locations, Cultures, Theories, and Methods. Felicia?
Thank you. That was the end of my talk. No, I need to, one day I'll stop writing titles that are as long as an abstract. Hello, bonvenue, ahlan bika, bonyi, and welcome to all of you. We originally had planned to meet in Montreal. So we thank the Cayuga Nation, whose land and waters are unceded there, for their hospitality. Perhaps each of us can be grateful to our common sky and the energy of the earth that makes our meeting possible, and for the earlier human inhabitants of our own homes and workplaces. My employer, the University of Connecticut, is on the territory of the Mohican, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples, who have stewarded this land and its waters for generations. Our state has the Mohican Pequot name Connecticut for its beautiful, wide, clean river that flows through our many hills and rocks. Mohican is actually an Algonquin or part of the Algonquin languages or Algic family, a language that also includes Cree, an ancestral language of one of our keynote speakers, Professor Jeffrey Anslus. Algonquin languages also include Arapaho, a language that gave its name to the county where I was born in Colorado. I put a little star where that is so you can see. So potentially I could have shared a common language family with Professor Anslus besides English and psychojargon, but because of the history of politics, I don't. Politics have and do divide people who would otherwise speak the same languages. Oh, and so do mountains. When my family was preparing to go abroad for an ISPP conference one year, we were studying up on places and practicing languages, and my youngest child asked me why there are different languages. Possibly my favorite thing about having children is getting to experience the world through their eyes. As adults, it is so easy to take things as a given when really things might not have to be the way they are. And so asking why and why they can be different are opportunities for learning and awe and invention. After a moment, I confess that I gave my 5-year-old daughter a non-political answer as to why there are different languages, which was mountains. I said, people end up speaking different languages because people travel, and after they move, when there are barriers that are hard to cross, like mountains, different people, groups of people don't see each other that often. And meanwhile, since everybody always has to invent new words and phrases to suit new experiences and ideas, each little pocket of people starts to speak a little differently than the other pockets speak, and after a while they're all speaking different languages. Now, in truth, I made all that up. There are real scholars who are deducing historical human migratory patterns from linguistic similarities and differences, and such things as smiling norms as a function of migration heterogeneity. But mountains occur to me more than, say, oceans or ice that might have occurred to you just because I was born in mountains. This is a photo of near my father's childhood home. I'm going to make this point several times today, that the examples in our heads can drive the hypotheses we generate. The multiplicity of languages I find both wonderful and awful. Altogether, the multiplicity of languages shows us more about how humans can be, how they can feel, how they can relate to one another, what they notice, and all the different kinds of music that we can make with our voices. There are special ways of expressing ideas in particular language that have no equivalent in other languages. For example, Polly Walker says that the Mi'kmaq and Ojibwe people have ancient tenses called forgiveness tenses. Forgiveness tenses connote that an old conflict has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction and that healing the whole community has occurred. Using an ancient forgiveness tense when discussing ongoing conflicts is a tool to help communities with reconciliation and healing. Likewise, the multiplicity of cultures with their meanings and implicit assumptions and ways of doing things is an enormous gift, because learning from other cultures can help us get unstuck in patterns we have that hurt people. As the novelist Kurt Vonnegut said about cultural variety, it's a source of hope. It means we don't have to continue this way if we don't like it. Alas, having separate languages and cultures also divides us, and the solution to have one uniform, quote, universal language, whether one language is imposed by law, such as the Romans and many colonial powers have done, or occurs de facto, as in contemporary science and commerce, is often oppressive. It deprives us monolinguals from unknown linguistic riches and leaves us ignorant. But worse, it endangers the survival of languages and of language communities as communities. And it creates differential burdens, as authors and our journal editors and reviewers know. This is a problem for ISPP to confront together. Our recent ISPP survey showed that the 708 respondents we had come from 70 countries and together speak at least 51 languages. And with 60% of us fluent in 2 or more languages, but not everyone fluent in English. I argue that trying to make us more uniform would make us much poorer. One way that we in ISPP are addressing multilingual access is that our journal now allows authors to provide translations of their abstracts so that they can be read more broadly, not only by other scholars, but by anybody who can read, the press, the public, and our research participants. We're working to translate more and more of our teaching materials and other information on the website for our members too. Today, I'm going to talk about how political psychology as a discipline benefits from the diversity within ISPP. I'm not going to trivialize diversity and inclusion. They're not just about showing off having more spices in the spice cabinet. The diversity and divisions that exist within and among nations today come from histories and divisions as painful as migration, colonization, persecution, decolonization, and losses of knowing that we're a common people with a common language and history. For ISPP to be a community, then, we need to be a deliberate community, and that takes effort, open-mindedness, forbearance, and the willingness not to win all the time. Nonetheless, it is where we are as a world, and I hope to show that in ISPP our diversity makes us strong, flexible, and united rather than uniform and inflexible and fragile. I view diversity and inclusion as ways to overcome the ordinary ways that being human can lead to systematic errors and biases. And when we know that we have errors and biases, we know that we have to change the way we do our science. And being inclusive of a variety of theoretical points of view, disciplines, methods, research topics, including different cultures and different political systems, I think collectively we can reduce the biases substantially and make better science, as well as form for ourselves a better community. I'll illustrate this by talking about research from a few different ISPP members. I'll start by generalizing measurement theory of Campbell and Fisk, which has 2 main assumptions. First, that every measure has error, and to some unknown degree usually, and that it might be biased. And second, that different measurement methods or instruments have different biases and errors. The way, therefore, to reduce error in science and to try not to augment and add up biases all the same direction is to use multiple different measures and multiple different methods. That sounds like one already knows what to measure, but deciding what to measure is not a trivial decision at all, because human beings and their relationships are complex systems They have many interdependent parts that can self-organize and change in time. No one discipline can be expert in how to postulate or measure every single process or construct that's important, even in just this figure, and this is only a tiny sample of what's relevant in political psychology. So there are 4 normal biases that I can see that that are normal parts of being human, and I'm going to give some examples about how those biases occur, and also how ISPP members' research is working around them. The first aspect of being human is the hardest to notice unless you're fortunate enough to travel or to make friends with newcomers, and that is that we all acquire cultural worldviews as we grow up. A cultural worldview tells us what is. It then influences what we perceive and interpret. So we could look at this picture and ask things like, are there such thing in the world as foreigners, women, the dead? In your culture, is nature separate than culture, or could visiting a natural site be a cultural experience? Those are the kinds of questions for which worldviews imply answers without us even realizing they could be questions. In other words, cultural worldviews provide us with a given set of assumptions about what is real, what does or does not need to be explained, and what is important. And though we draw upon cultural worldviews to understand and act on the world, worldviews are usually implicit and shared, which means they become invisible, at least to adults. When we get the imagination drummed out of us, then we can forget that it's possible that other things exist besides the givens of the worldview, that there are questions about how things happen or why they are as they are that are not provided by the worldview. So for you students out there, and for those of you who are parents or who are teachers, I admonish you to treasure curiosity, nurture curiosity, because it's an escape door from being stuck in a worldview. You might notice that there are parallels between cultural worldviews and theories. Worldviews tell us what is, and theories in parallel give us constructs about what is or what happens. And theories also imply, like worldviews, what's important. The invisibility of worldviews can be like the invisibility of hidden assumptions that theories and methods can have. Oh, sorry, I'm pushing the wrong mice. I have 2. Theories that fit our cultural worldviews make sense to us more easily, and others in that worldview will agree, but that process could give an extra scientific reason for theories to be accepted. Studying cultural worldviews is kind of like throwing flour on a ghost so that you can see it. A study by our longtime member and ISPP ambassador, Dr. Christina Montiel, does this. Dr. Montiel and her colleagues Audra Umel and Marlene de Leon found a topic about which there was little consensus in their country. In fact, a nearly divided vote in the Philippine legislature concerning a reproductive health bill. Recognizing that worldviews have to be applied to give meaning to new events, they analyzed the speeches that proponents and opponents of the bill made. They made the assumptions that these speech acts position the speaker and those with opposing views in a kind of moral field. So they used quite a lot of theory to analyze their big data. First, they employed software to analyze those data with 117 legislative speeches with over 19,000 words. And they had the computer count the most frequently used words by each side of the debate. They then took a sample of the speeches from each side, and they read and reread those speeches together to figure out what moral story, from a human being's point of view, the speakers were trying to tell. And to show that the deeper content of the speaker's reasoning was consistent with their data from the word count study, they wrote storylines, and each of those storylines had to use the 10 most frequently used words from the study in a sensible way. Their studies help us see worldviews that are easy to take for granted and not to see, and it showed people actively using them in policy debate. This is something that social dominance theory has assumed to occur, but we haven't documented it ourselves. What we and others have done in surveys is to measure or manipulate frameworks of legitimizing myths, because we hypothesize that people draw on cultural worldviews to invent justifications for their policies or practices. Sometimes those worldviews come from elites, and sometimes the legitimizing myths do, but often they come from widely shared cultural ideologies. For example, the two quoted items you can see on this slide that we use to measure belief in legitimizing myths, we conducted this study in the first year of the most recent Arab uprisings. They began nearly as quotes from foreign policy elites who generally oppose Arab autonomy. And because those beliefs mediate the influence of social dominance orientation on the endorsement of the policy outcomes for Arab autonomy, they meet the empirical criterion of social dominance theory for being legitimizing myths. So one might ask, does it mean that those beliefs, those legitimizing myths, are not facts? No, it doesn't mean that. It does, though, show that they serve a particular political function. One of the most difficult kinds of legitimizing myths to see is meritocracy. People in many societies have the idea that those who have some kind of virtue, and what that virtue is varies quite a lot, but we all have a system that says that whatever people have some kind of virtue can or will or should end up having better lives than people who don't have that kind of virtue. So this ideology of meritocracy, whether it's based in Confucianism or the Protestant work ethic or karma, all serve as the bases and apologies for social and political and bureaucratic systems. A new paper by Mariana Perez de Miranda and her colleagues illustrates how meritocracy and race stereotypes operate as legitimizing myths. In their study, they had white Europeans judge whether certain individual prisoners should be released from prison early to limit the very real crowding risks of COVID within prisons. In a survey experiment, they assessed how much individuals believed in meritocracy, their levels of social dominance orientation, egalitarianism, and they manipulated the race of the prisoners and whether each prisoner had committed a crime that was either stereotypically associated with whites, that is embezzlement, or with blacks, that is car theft. Their results show, first, that stereotypes about crimes function to legitimize the policy decision about being released from prison, because they found that black prisoners who were convicted of stereotypic black crimes were not released as often as prisoners in the other three conditions. In addition, they found that people who endorse meritocracy, which is not defined as being white on their measure, nonetheless were less likely to support releasing any black prisoner, as were those lower on SDOE. So Dr. Perez de Miranda and her colleagues' data are showing us that an ostensibly race-neutral, non-biased legitimizing ideology of meritocracy is in fact more favored by people who act with racist bias. I've talked now about hard to detect implicit cultural worldviews. My mountains example also shows that experience creates expectations for us of what is normal. Peter Hegarty has shown that another implicit bias, besides cultural worldviews, creates problems for us as human scientists, and this comes from the fact that what we've been exposed to creates implicit expectations or norms. The bias is that we tend to want to explain whatever violates our expectations instead of explaining what confirms them. The bias is a serious one for scientists, as Peter has pointed out, because it suggests that we will be biased towards explaining, quote, non-normative people as, quote, different, without explaining other people. This would be like having a theory of gender politics that discusses only women and not men nor any other gender. Peter and Carmen Bichel content coded hundreds of random articles from 4 journals published by the American Psychological Association, and they looked to see if gender differences were reported in those papers, and if so, how. In the papers that highlighted gender differences in the title or in the abstract or both, the authors explained women and girls many more times than they explained men and boys. In other words, they're using more words and more page space to talk about what it is about women and girls than they are giving scientific attention to men and boys. They also looked at which gender was positioned either at the left or the top of graphs or tables, because whatever's at the left or the top in left to right, what languages, serves as ground, and the other part serves as figure. So that's pointing out sort of what the contrast point is. They found that males are in the ground position. So here's the data about discussing gender differences, and you can see they're discussing females more than they're discussing males. And then when they look at androcentrism in the graphs and tables, they see that the positioning of the male in the implicit ground position is more than chance everywhere, except for in one exception, which they predicted, and that was that in developmental psychology, when the researchers were describing parents, who people often think of prototypically as women, researchers describe gender differences in terms of why fathers differ than mothers 80% of the time. Peter has further shown that the way people read these kinds of descriptions as group differences, as who is figure and ground, feeds right back into teaching people what to expect as category norms. Now, to me, this highlights the potential bias from a serious problem with the bias in the availability of data. What kind of people and what kind of societies or what kind of governments do we learn about in our ordinary education and socialization? Those may serve as exemplars of what we as scientists think is normal, and also what we teach our students and children is normal. I'm embarrassed to tell you that I was an adult, maybe even adult with tenure, before I learned anything about the Mississippian culture. When I was growing up, when we were taught about the ancient civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, we were taught about the Aztecs and the Incas, probably because they both built huge stone cities that remain, and perhaps also because the conquistadores came to try to take their riches. We were not taught about the Mississippian culture, who built many cities across North America using dirt mounds. So you can ask, if your society builds with dirt instead of stone, or grass instead of concrete, does that make you a poorer example of a human society? I think not. But if you use stone and metal, if you're wealthier, you leave more visible evidence of your way of living. Likewise, the more you change the natural environment, the more evidence you leave of your existence. We confront this problem when we're doing comparative studies that richer and more organized countries have better government statistics than poorer countries or than countries in chaos do. But this doesn't make nation states more normal as examples of human political organization. The accessibility of information is also influenced by language barriers and by acculturation processes, by how we learn the stories of our own, quote, people, right? For example, for a long time, and I'll give an apology for giving an American one here, but for a long time, the history and systems of government that were invented to create the US focused on its similarities and differences only from European political systems. But there's considerable evidence that those that are credited with founding the US, authoring the Articles of Confederation, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and so forth, knew and admired several aspects of the political culture and practices of nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and that they used those nations' ideas to invent the US government. For example, In colonial times, the Haudenosaunee men's councils recommended to their tribe whether to go to war, but the women's council had the deciding vote because women controlled the food supply. In parallel, the U.S. separation of powers means that the executive branch, the president's branch, controls the military, but the legislature has to approve of going to war because it controls the budget. Women's equal representation in each clan within the Haudenosaunee nations, and I've listed here current leaders of one of the nations, and their rights to vote and to veto male chiefs inspired some white women voting rights activists. The famous meeting for women's rights at Seneca Falls, New York, named after the Seneca Nation, is one of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I've worried actually that biases in what societies are easier to know about has led to mistheorizing as I've thought about social dominance theory. Jim Sedanius and I independently both have always had the idea that it's important to do cross-cultural research and to specify the kinds of societies that social dominance theory describes. In fact, in a whole lot of the contemporary world, within or between nations, both, we are organized as group-based dominant societies, and we have some degree of sexism. But then nearly the whole world now is also in some degree of post-colonialization, and colonies are group-based dominance hierarchies. Also, the examples that we tend to know from history, as I've said, tend to be empires, which by definition are group-based dominant societies. But consider this. The oldest known societies in the world, and there are hundreds of them, which we know because of the 500 languages they speak, may be between 14,000 and 40,000 years of continuous existence. They're the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and they're not group dominant societies. Rather, they are comfortable societies that maintained ecological sustenance by keeping themselves separate. Our whole reasoning of what we wanted to explain in social dominance theory strikes me that it might have been different if we wanted to consider that encroachment rather than dominance was the fundamental social organizational problem to explain. There is a huge opportunity in belonging to an international society, and that is that by listening to other people, especially those who don't share our cultural or disciplinary worldviews, we can learn things of value and perhaps find solutions to problems that we couldn't imagine on our own. I know that it's an extra burden to have to learn English to read and write science, and I have much sympathy for that because I'm not good at languages myself. The only compensation I know is that people who are multilingual and multicultural do have a big advantage in their work. So I point out the work of my former student, I-Ching Lee, who's on our political psychology editorial board. She not only speaks Chinese, Taiwanese, English, but also fancy statistics. The fact that she could access comparable data about the US and Taiwan in separate languages was necessary for her to do her dissertation research to compare those two democracies. And her deep understanding of different cultures, for example, what does it mean to have a long-term orientation, something we have a hard time understanding in the US, has led to some major breakthroughs in understanding group differences and gender differences on social dominance orientation, on how to conceptualize culture, on which cultures are more likely to have patriarchy in the family be the root of the way that people learn to accept social dominance. But since societies are not independent, they mutually influence each other and they contact each other in a variety of ways. We don't take each separate society as a case for testing hypotheses about social organization, but we can still be thoughtful about why we pick particular settings for our research. In fact, a paper I still assign to students in experimental methods by Phoebe Ellsworth recommends that we choose field settings for studies in which we believe our hypotheses could be disconfirmed rather than confirmed. So let me tell you about a paper by Reem Saab, who's been one of our ISPP ambassadors to Arab regions, and her colleagues, that seem to select two settings for testing the same hypotheses. They wanted to know about when people would support aggressive collective action strategies, such as damaging property or killing people. Based on several different theories, they decided that how effective people think peaceful collective action strategies are, and also how effective people think aggressive collective action strategies are, should interact. One interaction could take the form that aggression is the last resort, to be relied on only when peaceful strategies are perceived to be ineffective and aggressive ones are effective, like they showed in their left graph here. The second hypothesis they tested, they call the gun and the olive branch, as they show in the right figure. And this states that people would endorse whatever method they think is effective, but in addition, that even though aggression could lead to counter-aggression, it could be illegal, it could put one in danger. If you have nothing to lose, because neither form of aggression will be effective, you might as well try aggression. So that's what they show with this little dot here, that's their nothing to lose hypotheses. They tested their hypotheses in two different locations with regard to two different political contexts. In study one, they used an online sample of British students when their government was proposing substantial cuts to education funding and raising tuition. So notice that if you assume that British students live in a responsive democracy that they can influence for peaceful means, then you might assume that only the efficacy of peaceful protest should be the critical ingredient there. Study 2 was a random sample of Palestinian adults surveyed during the Second Intifada. Notice that if you assume that violent protest is normative for Palestinians, which is not a very nice assumption, or that the Israeli government is not responsive to their concerns, then you could expect to disconfirm the nothing to lose hypothesis as well. By critically selecting two different contexts where it makes sense for their hypotheses to be disconfirmed, Reem Saab et al. Provided excellent conditions for testing their hypotheses. Another issue of bias that we need to address is that we do know from many people's work that group positions influence people. The need to focus on all people scientifically, as I mentioned with norm theory, extends especially to intergroup relations. We know that how people do in life has very much to do with their nationality and their gender and other aspects of the social categories that are assigned to them. We also know that their positions can lead them to have different perceptions, to different endorsement of legitimizing myths, different identities, different interpretations of things, and so forth. In my opinion, there's been a huge improvement in a lot of intergroup relations work in the recent decades, because they don't seem to any longer take the perspective mainly of dominant groups. And I realized in writing the talk that there's been such a lot of this research that I can't even summarize it in the talk. For example, we know from John Dixon and Kevin Durheim that Black South Africans do not necessarily desire contact in their personal relationships with white South Africans. And we know from Herman Schwartz and colleagues that that the affect that children experience while they're having conflict influence the nature of prejudice or lack of prejudice that they develop. We know from Tamar Sagi and others that the idea of a common in-group identity that equally subsumes both dominant and subordinate groups may not be seen as neutral and inclusive equally by people in those groups. A national representative survey of South Africa done in 2000 by Jim Gibson tested whether the population accepted the truth of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That is, whether they accepted a set of statements about apartheid and how reconciled they were to sharing the country with either whites if they were black respondents or blacks if they were not black respondents. He also looked at the relationship between these two variables of truth and interracial reconciliation. Consistent with the group positions perspective, he found that blacks were less reconciled with whites than the more powerful racial groups were reconciled with blacks. Consistent with social dominance theory's ideological asymmetry hypothesis, he found that accepting the truth about apartheid was positively correlated with reconciliations for whites, colored people, and South Africans with Asian backgrounds, but that the two were not related for blacks. The social dominance theory prediction stems from the idea that aspects of group dominant societies that help people always work better for those in dominant than in subordinate groups. Our former early career committee chair, Shelley McEwen, studied young adults in Northern Ireland, which has a long history of Protestant domination of Catholics and of violence between the two groups, not always symmetric. She found that some people in both religious groups are ready to adopt a new and inclusive group identity called Northern Irish. They're the people on this side. Interestingly, in this case, the dominant group, that is those who identified as British and Protestant, did not find this new Northern Irish identity to be as inclusive or appropriate as the subordinated groups do. So sometimes there's the opposite problem. These and many scores of other studies examine the perspectives of people in groups who are differently situated, and good theory can make sense of each group's perspectives on their own terms, and not just by leaving one group, the non-normative group, to be explained. They also show that good contextualization is important for good science. Just as cultural worldviews give us things we see and don't see, so can theories. The theme of this year's conference is about recognition and reclaiming marginalized spaces. Our program co-chairs, Alison Harrell and Carla Hukumo, helped me craft this theme and invited special speakers and attendees to bring some attention to the ways that colonization and decolonization are still very present in the lives of people around the world and inform a lot of what we study in the society. For people in intergroup relations in particular, being specific about intergroup situations could make us more accurate and able to observe things that vaguer theoretical frameworks might obscure. It's pretty vague to call some groups advantaged or stereotypes, and it is not even always accurate. Women are not, quote, other minorities, although more than one colleague has described women as such. It would be a shame to let colonization, to stop taking it seriously for it to devolve into accusations of authenticity or belonging. Our colleague Idam Ekaputra, one of our active Southeast Asian ISPP ambassadors, wrote a very interesting paper that analyzes a sermon that a particular imam in Indonesia gave. He was sermonizing against a political candidate in Jakarta because the candidate was, quote, not indigenous. That's because the candidate was of Chinese descent and not Muslim. Of course, there have been Chinese people in Indonesia for a very long time. And of course, Indonesia is not the only place where religion or religious sect is the basis of claims for who is indigenous. But the example suggests that we scientists need to attend to what our concepts mean to the people to whom we apply them. So I'll give you an important example, and it's just one. Our colleague May Albzor, another ISPP ambassador for Arab scholars, has written 2 searching papers concerning what normalization means for Palestinians and using a settler colonial frame. In the first paper, she points out that when 2 groups have been in armed conflict, the prescribed procedure in international relations is for them to stop the violence, develop a treaty and some kind of reconciliation procedure, and then eventually to normalize relations with exchanges of diplomatic corps, trade agreements, border agreements, and so forth. With respect to Israeli-Palestinian relations, though, the term normalization sometimes is used to mean that Palestine, which itself is divided in several ways, should recognize Israel without the initial reconciliation steps that would show Israel to be recognizing Palestine. In the nation-state system, having normalized relations means a kind of belonging and legitimacy and has lots of practical, economic, and security implications. So, for such reasons, one might assume that it would be desired by people who are not recognizing as having a state, such as Palestinians. May and her colleagues conducted a survey study of how West Bank Palestinians view normalization. They both asked them what they thought Tatbia meant and to rate their agreement with 15 specific ways that Palestinians and Israelis could relate as a way to conceive of normalization. The most common open-ended responses showed that few of them viewed normalization positively, and many just described it in neutral intergroup terms. But more found it negative, and that it would mean accepting Israeli disappearance of Palestine. I'm afraid it is often the case that the solutions that have been proposed in more dominant circles to unequal intergroup relations, whether they're current settler colonial societies or the great-great-grandchildren of settler colonialism, can easily burden people in subordinate groups more. This is one reason why we need to make sure that their perspectives are not omitted due to the implicit biases in what data are available or cultural worldviews or the expectations and norms that I've talked about today. But we can learn to see with more than one set of eyes. We can overcome these biases by uniting in our diversity. So I'll close with one last example of research. This is by Yingyi Hong, a member of the Governing Council and an ISPP ambassador in East Asia. And she showed in some now classic experiments on bicultural people. In their cases, they were studying acculturation to Western and Chinese ways of understanding. Yingyi and her colleagues first primed their participants with worldviews by using pictures that showed either Chinese emblems or US emblems, or in the control condition, just geometric figures. They then asked the participants to explain an individual's behavior, and it was either a fish swimming in front of other fish or an overweight boy who ate cake in a restaurant. And the results are simple. They find that the same bicultural people make attributions more to internal causes when they're primed with Western icons, like these conditions, and they make more attributions to external causes when they're primed with Chinese icons, consistent with a relational worldview rather than with an individualistic agency worldview. In other words, what these data are showing is that the same people can be flexible when they've been enculturated in more than one way. And although I'm not saying it's easy, I do think that all of us can learn from each other and from our research participants to have more than one set of eyes. I've taken you on a long journey today, but I can, with many stops, but I can briefly summarize my points and then I'll close. I've suggested that we might introduce biases into our research because of our cultural worldviews, because of our learned exemplars, because there are biases in which people leave ample evidence of their existence, and because it's easy to overgeneralize from one group's perspective, especially when that group is culturally or politically dominant. I suggested with examples that some antidotes to these problems are to include diverse disciplines, methods, and theories, to seek out settings for research in which hypotheses can be disconfirmed, to consider why exceptional cases are exceptional instead of assuming that they're errors, to be willing to sit with the discomfort of a theoretical or cultural worldview that is not your own, to be willing to use your imagination to consider how the world looks to people who don't share your legitimizing myths. We scientists, after all, are the privileged adults who don't have to stop using our imaginations and curiosity. And when we do this, and we're willing to play with each other and play with each other's ideas, we make a much better political psychology and a much more inclusive playground. I thank you for your participation in ISPP and in our common work. It's truly inspiring to me. It has been my honor to be elected to serve you, and although I wish I had done so better, I have done so with my best concern for you and for our society. I hope you have a wonderful conference.
Thank you, Felicia. At this point, we have about 15 minutes left that we can take questions from the audience. I know many of you have been here for the full presentation, and so I think we'd be really curious to hear your questions and your comments. While you're typing those in, I just wanted to pose a first one. So you ended on a comment and directions for solutions, and I'm wondering if you have more specific thoughts about how we train ourselves as researchers, but also the next generation of political psychologists to confront the 4 types of biases that you laid out in your talk so masterfully.
I've had the tendency to try to get all of my graduate students to go to ISPP just to learn that not every place is like where they grew up. So that's one thing. I really do encourage people to be talking to each other. I think it's an excellent idea to pick up a book or paper, even a cultural history of some place that's really not familiar, and try and read it from the point of view of yourself as a cultural being and yourself as a social scientist. I feel that I've been benefited, just even though I haven't, for example, I have never specifically studied Indigenous peoples, but that it's been beneficial to me to realize that not everybody lives the way we are. So, or the people I know, that is. And so I think that's important. I also, for example, when I teach theories of intergroup relations, my across the whole semester, I very, very deliberately have both personal readings, but also research literature that are from many different locations in the world and from many different groups' perspective. And so that's one of the deliberate practices that I do to try and make sure that we're not too bent on one particular frame or one particular historical example.
So there's a question from Lucas Walrich, and it is: many researchers from across the world still use US samples, given that data collection there is very easy due to MTurk and company. Could there be a case to collaboratively build research participant platforms or many lab approaches to extend studies beyond specific collaborations?
I think that's a fantastic idea, because I do think it is a major bias to focus just on where it's easy to collect data. And although we've had the weird paper out for decades now, and the notion that there's exceptional things about Americans, there's still, I was surprised, for example, years ago when I was visiting Germany and my colleagues were talking about racism, and the examples they used were American racism. And I think, well, why should that be your tip of the tongue example? But I think it's because of what people read. Now, it could be that they were being polite to me and trying to give an example that would make sense to me. But I do think that, the only way that I've been able to collect data with no money from lots of places in the world is through collaborations with ISPP. And I do know that there's some colleagues who sort of have made a pact, even within the US, to collect regional data, that people can make pacts to collect data for each other from different global spots. And I would encourage not doing it just on college students. It is harder. Our questions don't make as much sense to people who haven't been to college, and that's instructive. And I don't think that means that it's our participants who are wrong. But sure, that's an excellent idea. Thank you for proposing that. And if you need to post something to the membership, we could, to instigate an activity like that, we could certainly publicize it through the society.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
There's another question from Iladora Donan, Efimov. Apologies for the pronunciation. Could you please speak a bit about about how cultural worldviews can impact tenets like objectivity that scientists often hold dear?
That's a very rich and deep question. I do think that there's been an argument, of course, in the last 100 years in the Western canon about whether Western version of enlightenment means that there's an objectivity out there that scientists are able to observe. I think that that's been reasonably criticized by people within, in part because of measurement theory, that we realize that every time we measure something that we come up with a sort of a bias. And I think that we've come to share the notion that there are multiple perspectives that can make sense all at the same time. I'm not speaking very well, but I think that the that the notion that there is something objective is an interesting one that may be helpful for making certain kinds of propositions, but it's not helpful in many other things. So, for example, in interpersonal and intergroup conflicts, it's often not helpful to insist that there's only one objective perspective. You could follow up if I wasn't getting at your question. I think it was a rich one.
Are there any other questions from the audience or comments that you would like to hear President Pratto speak about? If not, then I will take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending this presidential address. And I would invite you to join us for the meet and greet coffee break that's coming up at 10. You'll have a chance to meet in small groups some of the other participants at ISPP. And I just wanted to note there's a few things coming in on the chat now. Thanks for jumping in here. From Tina Lee mentions that white cultural worldviews have already defined most scientific endeavors throughout history. So that's a compliment to Felicia's comment. And then Anka Minescu seconds Nick's point about thanking Felicia for all your service to ISPP. So I think that's something we can all echo here. So there's lots of thank yous, lots of congratulations for Felicia for the work that you've been doing. And we hope to be able to continue these conversations over the course of the next 3 days. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Felicia. And we'll see you at the next set of panels, roundtables, and blitzes today. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.